Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from the remote rural backroads and hollows of Pennsylvania. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten corners of the Keystone State and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The property came to me through my grandmother's will, which felt strange because I didn't even know she owned land up in Potter County. I was 29, working remotely, and the idea of a cabin in the woods sounded perfect for someone who spent 60 hours a week staring at spreadsheets. My girlfriend at the time, Vanessa, thought I was being impulsive. Maybe I was. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon polish when I signed the deed. He kept the meeting short, didn't make small talk, which I appreciated at the time. The drive up took longer than I expected. Potter County sits in north-central Pennsylvania, and once you leave the main highway, the roads turn into these narrow 2-lane things that wind through dense forest. I stopped for gas in Coudersport and asked the attendant for directions to Lyman Run Road. He was maybe 60, wearing a Carhartt jacket with grease stains. He gave me this look, not unfriendly exactly, just careful, and said, "Your grandmother's old place." I didn't remember telling him whose cabin it was. He drew me a map on a napkin and told me to make sure I left before dark. I laughed it off. Told him I was planning to stay the whole weekend. He just folded his arms and said, "Suit yourself." The cabin sat about 3 miles down a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in probably a decade. Branches scraped my car on both sides. When I finally pulled into the clearing, I sat there for a minute just looking at it. The place was small, maybe 600 square feet, with a covered porch that sagged on one side. The windows were intact, which surprised me. Someone had boarded up the back door with fresh planks. The wood was lighter than the rest of the structure. That seemed odd. Why board up the back, but leave the front door alone? Inside, everything was exactly how you'd imagine an old woman's cabin. Floral curtains, a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchenette with a rusted sink. The furniture was covered in sheets, and dust hung in the air thick enough to taste. I spent the first hour just cleaning, sweeping out mouse droppings, airing out the musty smell. My phone had no signal, which I'd expected. That was part of the appeal, honestly. No emails, no Teams notifications, just silence and woods. I tried to tell myself the quiet was peaceful, and for the first few hours it was. Around 6 in the evening, I sat on the porch with a beer I'd brought from home. The forest around the cabin was thick, mainly oak and maple, with some pine mixed in. The tree line came right up to the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet from the porch. I could hear birds settling in for the night, that twilight chorus that always sounds both calming and somehow melancholy. The temperature was dropping fast. I brought a jacket, but I was still wearing just a t-shirt, and I remember thinking I should go inside soon. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't constant. It came in drifts, like when wind shifts direction. Rot, but not like a dead animal exactly. Sweeter, thicker, the kind of smell that makes your sinuses burn. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The breeze picked up, and the smell got stronger. I looked toward the tree line, squinting in the fading light. There were shapes hanging between 2 pine trees. At first I thought maybe it was laundry or tarps, something my grandmother had left. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized what I was looking at. They were bones, small ones strung on what looked like wire or cord, hanging in vertical lines between the trees. Maybe a dozen of them. They swayed slightly in the breeze, and I could hear a faint clicking sound as they knocked against each other. I stood there staring for probably a full minute. My mouth had gone dry, that taste you get when your body knows something's wrong before your brain catches up. I wanted to believe it was something innocent, wind chimes made from animal bones, maybe some kind of rural decoration, but the arrangement felt deliberate, purposeful, and the way they hung at eye level, right where someone standing on the porch would see them. I went inside and locked the door. For the next hour, I tried to rationalize it. Told myself plenty of rural folks used animal remains for various things. Art projects, I don't know. My grandmother had been a strange woman, from what little I knew of her. I'd only met her twice, both times when I was very young. Maybe this was just some eccentricity of hers. The problem was I couldn't shake the feeling that those bones weren't just decoration. They felt like a message. Night came fast in that hollow. By 8 o'clock, it was fully dark, the kind of darkness you don't get near cities. I lit the kerosene lamp I'd found in the kitchen. The cabin had no electricity, and sat at the small table trying to read a book I'd brought. The words wouldn't stick. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the blackness beyond the glass. Every few minutes I'd hear something, a crack of a branch, a rustle in the undergrowth, normal forest sounds, I kept telling myself. Animals moving around, nocturnal creatures starting their night. Around 10, I heard the voice. It came from somewhere behind the cabin, muffled but clear enough to understand. A woman's voice calling a name. Thomas, Thomas, where are you? The accent was old-fashioned Pennsylvania Dutch, that specific lilt you sometimes still hear in the rural parts. My hands went cold. Thomas was my grandfather's name. He died in 1987, almost 40 years ago. I didn't move. The voice called again, same words, same tone. Patient, almost gentle. Like someone calling a child who'd wandered off. I sat frozen at that table, every muscle locked. The rational part of my brain screamed that it had to be another person, a neighbor, someone looking for someone else. But we were 3 miles down a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded like it was coming from right outside the back wall, the wall with the boarded-up door. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. Time felt elastic, stretched thin. Eventually the voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the calling. I kept waiting for it to start again, straining my ears for any sound. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I didn't sleep that night, just sat at the table, watching the windows, listening. Around 4 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, not the quick scurry of an animal, the steady rhythm of someone walking. They started at the left end of the porch and moved right, crossing in front of the door. I could hear the old boards creaking under weight. My heart was slamming so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps reached the right end of the porch, paused, then came back. Left to right, right to left, patient, methodical. I wanted to look. Some part of me needed to see what was out there, but I couldn't make myself move. I sat there with my eyes locked on the door, watching the handle, terrified it would turn. The footsteps stopped right in front of the door. I heard breathing, wet, rattling breaths, like someone with fluid in their lungs. The door was old wood, gaps around the frame big enough that I could see slivers of the porch beyond. And in one of those gaps, I saw something pale press against the opening. Skin, I think, or something like skin. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, then slowly withdrew. The footsteps resumed. This time they went around the side of the cabin, toward the back, toward the boarded-up door. I heard them stop there, and then I heard something else. Scratching, slow, rhythmic scratching like fingernails on wood. It went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. After that, nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest waking up. I left as soon as there was enough light to see the road. I didn't pack carefully, just threw everything in my car and got out. When I backed out of the clearing, I looked one more time at the tree line. The bones were still there, swaying gently, and on the ground below them I saw what I'd missed in the dark the night before. There were more, dozens more, scattered in a wide circle around the cabin, small white shapes barely visible in the undergrowth. A perimeter. I drove straight through, didn't stop until I hit Coudersport. The same gas station attendant was working. When he saw me, he just nodded, like he'd expected to see me coming back looking the way I did. He didn't ask any questions. I didn't volunteer any explanations. I put the property up for sale 2 weeks later, priced it low, practically gave it away. The buyer was some developer from out of state who wanted to flip it. I didn't tell him anything. Maybe I should have, but part of me figured if he went up there, he'd just think it was vandalism or local pranks. He'd rationalize it the way I tried to. 3 months later, the sale fell through. The buyer backed out, wouldn't say why. The property is still sitting there, still mine technically. I get tax bills for it every year. I've thought about just letting it go to auction, but something stops me. Some superstitious part of my brain that worries if I abandon it completely, whatever was walking on that porch might come looking for me. I still hear that voice sometimes, right before I fall asleep. Thomas. Thomas, where are you? Patient, waiting, like it has all the time in the world. Story 2. My uncle's hunting camp sat in the Alleghenies, up near the Quehana Wild area. I'd been going there since I was 16, every November for deer season. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cinder block structure with bunks, a wood stove, and a generator. We only ran a few hours a day to save fuel. But it was tradition. My uncle Randall, my cousin Joel, and usually 2 or 3 other guys from town. We'd spend a week in the woods, tracking deer, playing cards, drinking beer, telling the same stories we'd told the year before. This particular year I was 34. November of 2024. Joel couldn't make it. His wife was 8 months pregnant, and one of the usual guys, Marcus, had blown out his knee. So it ended up being just me, Uncle Randall, and a guy named Pete Strickland who worked with my uncle at the lumber mill. I'd met Pete a few times, but didn't know him well. He was quiet, kept to himself, one of those guys who could sit in comfortable silence for hours. We drove up on a Sunday afternoon, the weekend before Thanksgiving. The access road was already getting icy, and we had to engage 4-wheel drive for the last 2 miles. The camp looked exactly how it always did, weathered, solid, surrounded by bare trees. Most of the leaves were down by then, just skeletons of branches against a gray sky. It was cold enough that I could see my breath, and the forecast called for snow later in the week. We spent that first evening getting settled in, organizing gear, splitting firewood. Pete took the bunk in the corner, the one farthest from the stove. Uncle Randall made chili on the propane stove, and we ate watching the sun set through the single window. The light faded fast, and by 6:30 it was full dark. We ran the generator for an hour so we could see to clean up, then shut it down and switched to battery-powered lanterns. Around 8, Uncle Randall pulled out a deck of cards, and we started playing poker. Penny ante stuff, just something to do. Pete was winning, which seemed to amuse my uncle. Quiet ones always clean up, he said, flipping cards onto the makeshift table. We'd played maybe 3 hands when we heard the sound. It came from outside, somewhere to the north of the camp. A whistle, not like a bird or a person calling to someone, a musical whistle, a tune I didn't recognize. 3 notes ascending, then 2 descending. It repeated 3 times, then stopped. Uncle Randall cocked his head. "Kids," Pete said. "Out here," I said. "It's 11 miles to the nearest house." We listened, but the whistle didn't repeat. Uncle Randall shrugged and dealt another hand. I tried to focus on the cards, but something about that sound had lodged in my brain. It was too clear, too deliberate. and the tune was wrong somehow, off-key or in a scale that didn't sound quite right. An hour later, we heard it again. Same tune, same pattern, but closer. This time it sounded like it was coming from maybe 50 yards away, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Pete stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the dark. "Can't see anything," he said. Uncle Randall suggested it might be hunters from another camp playing around, but we all knew that didn't make sense. It was Sunday night. Nobody else would be out there yet, and even if they were, they wouldn't be wandering around in the dark woods whistling. We decided to call it a night. Uncle Randall banked the fire in the wood stove, and we climbed into our bunks. I had trouble falling asleep. The wind had picked up, and the cinder block structure creaked and settled in ways I'd never noticed before. Every sound seemed amplified. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke to Pete shaking my shoulder. The camp was pitch black except for the faint red glow from the stove. "You hear that?" Pete whispered. I listened. At first, nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Circling the camp. Slow, steady steps in the dead leaves and undergrowth. They'd go quiet for a few seconds, then start again, always from a different direction. East side, then south, then west, like someone or something was walking the perimeter. Uncle Randall was awake too. I could see him sitting up in his bunk, a dark silhouette. "What the hell?" he muttered. The footsteps continued for maybe 10 minutes. Then they stopped at the door. We all froze. I was holding my breath without realizing it. The door was solid wood with a heavy bolt lock that we'd thrown before bed. I stared at it, waiting for a knock, for the handle to rattle, for something. Instead, the whistling started again. Right outside the door. The same tune, those same wrong notes. But this time it was close enough that I could hear the breath behind it. Whoever or whatever was out there had lungs, was pushing air through lips or teeth or something. Then it changed. The tune shifted, became something else. And I realized with a shock that made my stomach drop that I recognized it. It was Happy Trails, the old Roy Rogers song. My grandfather used to sing it. It was the song they played at his funeral. "That's not possible," I whispered. The whistling stopped. For a long moment, nothing. Then something scratched at the door, not a knock, not a bang. A slow, dragging scratch like a fingernail running down the wood grain. It went from top to bottom, then again. Methodical, patient. Uncle Randall grabbed the flashlight from beside his bunk and clicked it on. The beam swung wild for a second before he steadied it on the door. "Who's out there?" he called. His voice sounded steadier than I felt. The scratching stopped. Silence. "I've got a gun," Uncle Randall said, which was true. We all had rifles, unloaded, propped in the corner. "You'd better move along." Nothing. We waited, listening to our own breathing. Finally, after what must have been 5 minutes, we heard the footsteps again. But this time they were moving away, heading north into the woods. We listened until we couldn't hear them anymore. None of us slept after that. We sat in our bunks with the lanterns on, rifles loaded now, waiting for dawn. Pete kept looking at me with this expression I couldn't read. Around 4 in the morning, he said, "That song, how did it know that song?" I didn't have an answer. When the sun came up, Uncle Randall and I went outside to look around. The ground was soft, covered in leaves and pine needles. We found tracks. Boot prints looked like maybe a size 10 or 11. They circled the camp exactly as we'd heard, a complete perimeter about 20 feet from the walls. But here's what made us both stop and stare. The tracks just started. On the north side, there was suddenly a boot print pressed deep into the soft earth. But no tracks leading up to it. And on the south side, where the trail ended, same thing. The last print just stopped, no tracks leading away. Wind covered them, Pete suggested when we came back inside, but there hadn't been wind during the night, not enough to cover tracks that clear. We discussed leaving. Pete was all for it. Uncle Randall seemed torn. This was his camp, his tradition, and I could tell he didn't want to let something chase us off. I was somewhere in the middle. Part of me wanted to run. Part of me wanted to understand what had happened. In the end, we decided to stay one more night. If anything else happened, we'd pack up and leave in the morning. It seemed like a reasonable compromise at the time. That second day, we actually went hunting, spread out through the woods, each taking a different section. I didn't see a single deer, which was strange. Usually you'd at least see some does, even if no bucks were moving. The forest felt empty, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Just bare trees and silence. I got back to camp around 3. Pete was already there, cleaning his rifle. Uncle Randall showed up an hour later. None of us had seen anything worth mentioning. We made dinner, canned soup and crackers, and as the sun set, that familiar dread started building in my chest. The whistling started earlier this time, just after 7, while we still had the generator running and the lights on. Same tune at first, that ascending descending pattern, but it was different tonight. There were 2 of them, 2 distinct sources, one to the north, one to the south. They'd whistle in sequence, like they were calling to each other. Back and forth, back and forth. Then a third one joined in from the west. Jesus Christ, Pete said. He was standing now, backing away from the walls. What is this? The 3 whistles continued, overlapping now, creating this discordant harmony that made my teeth ache. Uncle Randall moved to the window trying to see out, but it was fully dark and the generator lights just made the glass reflective. We were blind. Then the whistles stopped, all at once. The silence was deafening. That's when we heard the scratching, not just at the door this time, at the walls all around us. Multiple sources scratching at the cinder block, dragging down the walls in slow, rhythmic strokes. I could feel the vibration through the floor. Something hit the roof. A heavy impact, like something had jumped or climbed up there. We all looked up. The ceiling was just plywood over rafters, insulated with fiberglass, not strong. Another impact, then another. Something was walking on the roof. I could track its position by the creaking boards. It moved from the south end to the north, then back again. "We're leaving," Uncle Randall said. "Now." We grabbed what we could. Rifles, truck keys, jackets. Forgot about everything else. Uncle Randall killed the generator, plunging us into darkness except for one flashlight. He threw the bolt on the door and yanked it open. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The flashlight beam swept across bare ground, trees, shadows, no sign of anything. We ran for the truck. I was in the back, Pete in the passenger seat, Uncle Randall driving. He jammed the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked but didn't catch. He tried again, same thing. "Come on," he muttered, pumping the gas. "Come on, you bastard." I looked out the rear window. In the darkness beyond the camp, I saw them, pale shapes moving between the trees, 3 of them. They weren't running, just walking, steady and patient, coming toward us. They were tall, taller than any person should be. Their arms hung too long, swinging as they walked. "Randall," I said. The engine caught. Uncle Randall threw it in gear and gunned it, spraying gravel. We fishtailed onto the access road and didn't slow down until we hit pavement. None of us spoke. We just drove, hands shaking, breath ragged. We stopped at a gas station in Carthouse, about 40 minutes away. Pete got out and threw up in the parking lot. Uncle Randall called his wife, told her we were coming home early. Didn't explain why. I sat in the truck bed, staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd seen. When we finally got home, I checked myself in the bathroom mirror. There were scratches on my forearms, 3 parallel lines, shallow but clear. I didn't remember getting them. They're still there, faint scars now. I don't know when they appeared. Uncle Randall sold the camp 6 months later. Told everyone he was getting too old for the upkeep. Pete moved to Ohio for a job opportunity, or at least that's what he told people. I haven't spoken to him since that night. I haven't been hunting since. Can't bring myself to go into the deep woods anymore. Every time I think about it, I hear that whistling in my head, those wrong notes, that discordant tune, and I remember those pale figures walking between the trees, their two long arms swinging, patient and unhurried, like they knew we'd come back eventually. A story 3. I was doing contract work that summer, boundary surveys for a timber company up in Elk County. Basically, I'd spend days walking property lines with a GPS unit and a laser rangefinder, marking trees, taking measurements, making sure the loggers knew exactly where they could cut. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. I'd gone through a rough breakup that spring and needed the quiet. The job site was about 15 miles south of Benezet, in a section of state forest that hadn't been logged in maybe 40 years. Old growth mixed with newer stuff, thick understory, the kind of woods where you could get turned around easy if you weren't paying attention. The timber company rep, a woman named Diane Marsh, walked me through the property on my first day, showed me the stakes marking the corners, gave me the survey maps. She mentioned that a previous contractor had started the job, but quit after 2 days. When I asked why, she just shrugged and said something about a family emergency. I didn't think much of it. My routine was simple. I'd park at the access point around 7 in the morning, hike in to wherever I'd left off the day before, and work until mid-afternoon. The terrain was rough, lots of elevation change, and the undergrowth was thick enough that I'd end up soaked with sweat by noon, even though it was only June. I'd break for lunch, usually just a sandwich and some water, then push through another few hours before hiking back out. The first 3 days were uneventful. I made good progress, marking maybe a half-mile of boundary line. The work was tedious but straightforward. I saw deer, heard plenty of birds, even spotted a black bear one morning, a young one that huffed at me and ambled off. Normal forest stuff. On the 4th day, I found the structure. I'd been following the eastern boundary, working my way downhill into a narrow ravine. The trees were dense there, lots of hemlock and white pine blocking out the sun. It was cooler, almost cold, and the ground was soft with decades of pine needles. I was watching my GPS, making sure I stayed on the line when I nearly walked into it. It was made of stacked stones, roughly waist-high in a circular shape maybe 10 feet across. No mortar, just stones fitted together and old. Really old. Moss covered most of it, and saplings were growing up through gaps in the structure. At the center was an opening, like a well dropping straight down into darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. I stood there for a minute trying to figure out what I was looking at. It wasn't on any of the survey maps. Could have been an old cistern or a mine shaft, I thought, though it seemed too far from any cleared land to be a homestead. I took a few photos with my phone, mostly just for documentation, then kept working. The boundary line ran right past it, heading further downhill. That's when I started noticing the quiet. The forest had gone silent. I hadn't consciously registered the normal sounds until they stopped. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. I stood there listening, feeling the hair on my neck prickle. The quiet pressed in thick and heavy. Then I heard something from inside the stone structure, a shuffling sound like fabric dragging on stone. I froze. The sound came again, definitely from down in that hole, something moving in the dark below. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the opening. My rational brain said it was probably an animal, raccoon, maybe a fox, that had gotten trapped down there. But some deeper instinct was screaming at me to move, get away, don't turn your back on it. I was maybe 20 feet away when I heard the voice. Help me. It was faint, echoing up from the hole. A man's voice, rough and strained. "Please help me." I stopped. Every civilized instinct said I should respond, should call down and ask if someone was hurt, maybe needed rescue. But something was wrong. The voice didn't sound quite right. The pitch was off, the cadence strange, like someone imitating speech without quite understanding how words were supposed to sound. "Please," the voice called again. "It's dark down here." I didn't answer. I stood there, torn between the social obligation to help someone in distress and the animal part of my brain that was screaming danger. The shuffling sound came again, closer to the opening. Then I heard something else. Breathing, heavy wet breathing echoing up from below. I ran, just turned and crashed through the undergrowth, not caring about the GPS line or the survey markers or anything except getting away from that place. I ran uphill, my lungs burning, branches whipping my face, until I burst out onto a logging road I didn't remember seeing before. I followed it until I found my truck, got in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. I sat there for maybe an hour, trying to calm down, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted. Maybe someone really was down there. Maybe they'd fallen in, gotten hurt, and I'd just abandoned them. The guilt gnawed at me, but I couldn't make myself go back. Not then. I called Diane Marsh when I got cell service. Told her about the stone structure, said I'd heard what sounded like someone calling for help, and suggested maybe we should contact local authorities, have them check it out. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The other contractor mentioned something like that. Is that why you're calling?" "Did he call the police?" I asked. "He tried. They went out there, didn't find anything. Said the structure was abandoned, probably 100 years old. No sign of anyone inside." "But I heard." "I know," she said. "He heard it too." She told me I could quit if I wanted, no hard feelings. The job had been cursed from the start, she said. 3 different contractors had tried over the past year. None of them finished. I asked what happened to the others. She said the first one just stopped showing up, wouldn't return calls. The second one, the guy right before me, had finished his 2 days and driven straight to the state police barracks, filed a report about possible human remains on the property. But the search turned up nothing. I should have quit. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't. Pride maybe, or stubbornness. The money was good and I needed it. I told Diane I'd think about it, then spent the evening in my motel room drinking beer and trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The next morning I went back, not to that ravine. I plotted a route that would keep me on the western boundary line, well away from the stone structure. I figured if I avoided that section, I'd be fine. I could finish the survey, collect my pay, and forget the whole thing. I worked the western line for 3 days without incident. Started to relax, even. Thought maybe I'd imagined the worst of it, let my mind run wild. The forest seemed normal again. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, all the usual sounds. I made good progress. On the 8th day, I was working a section of boundary line that ran through relatively flat terrain, mixed hardwoods with good visibility. Around noon, I stopped for lunch, found a fallen log to sit on. I was eating a turkey sandwich, checking my progress on the GPS, when I noticed something carved into a tree about 15 feet away. I walked over to get a closer look. Someone had carved a symbol into the bark, maybe chest high. It wasn't letters or numbers, just a design, 3 wavy lines stacked on top of each other with a circle above them. The cuts looked fresh, sap still oozing from the wounds. I touched it and my finger came away sticky. That's when I realized I could see more carvings, Same symbol carved into trees in a line leading back the way I'd come. I followed them, counting as I went. 7 trees, each with the same mark. The trail led toward the ravine, toward the stone structure. I stopped following, turned around, walked back to my log, tried to finish my lunch. But my appetite was gone and my hands were shaking again. Someone was in these woods. Someone was marking trees, leading me back to that place. But I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, and those carvings hadn't been there that morning. I'd walked right past those trees on my way in. I packed up and decided to call it a day early, headed back toward where I'd parked, following my GPS track. The route should have taken me about 40 minutes at a normal pace, but after an hour of walking, I still hadn't hit the access road. I checked the GPS. According to the coordinates, I should have been standing right at my truck, but I was in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees. I tried a different direction, walked for another 30 minutes, checked again, same thing. The GPS said I was at my destination, but I was still deep in the woods. The coordinates were right, but the landscape was wrong. That's when I heard the whistling. Not a tune this time, just a single sustained note coming from somewhere to my north. It held for maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I waited, listening. The note came again, same duration, but from a different direction. East this time, then south, then west. 4 sources surrounding me, each whistling that same flat note. I ran, didn't care about direction, just picked what felt like a way and crashed through the undergrowth. The whistling followed, staying at the same distance, that single note echoing through the trees. I ran until I tripped on a root and went down hard, smashing my knee on a rock. When I looked up, I was at the edge of the ravine. The stone structure was maybe 50 feet below me, and standing next to it was a figure. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with pale skin that looked gray in the shadows. Its proportions were wrong, torso too long, legs slightly bent, arms hanging past its knees. It stood perfectly still, facing the structure, not moving at all. As I watched, it tilted its head back and whistled. That same sustained note. 3 more answered from the woods around me. I scrambled backward, trying to be quiet, trying not to draw attention. My knee was screaming, probably bleeding, but I didn't care. I crawled behind a fallen log and lay flat, praying it hadn't seen me. For maybe 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard movement. The figure was climbing up the ravine slope, moving toward me. Not fast, but steady. I could hear rocks dislodging, sliding down behind it. I pressed myself flat against the ground, face in the dirt, not breathing. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet away. I didn't look up. Couldn't. I just lay there, eyes squeezed shut, every muscle frozen. I could hear it breathing, that same wet rattle I'd heard from the stone structure. Then I felt something touch my backpack, a gentle pressure like a hand resting on it. The touch moved up my back, to my shoulder, to my neck. Fingers, I think, though they felt too long, too thin. The voice, when it came, was right next to my ear. "Help me," it whispered. "Please." I didn't move, didn't respond. The fingers traced along my jawline, almost gentle. Then they were gone. The footsteps resumed, moving past me, heading uphill. I lay there until I couldn't hear them anymore, then waited another hour for good measure. When I finally stood up, my GPS was working again. The truck was 40 minutes away, exactly where it should be. I limped back, got in, and drove straight to the motel. Didn't even stop to clean the blood off my knee. I called Diane that night, told her I was done. She didn't argue, just said she'd mail my check for the work I'd completed. I left Pennsylvania the next morning and drove back to Maryland. Didn't even stay to pack properly, just threw everything in the car and left. About a month later, I got a call from a Pennsylvania number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a state police trooper named Heather Kowalski. She said they'd found my business card in a truck abandoned at a trailhead in Elk County. Asked if I knew a man named Marcus Delgado. I told her I didn't. She said he was the contractor who'd been hired after me to finish the survey. He'd gone into the woods 5 days ago and never came back. They'd found his truck, his equipment, his phone, but no sign of him. She asked if I'd experienced anything unusual while working that site. I didn't know how to answer that. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? Finally, I told her I'd heard strange sounds, seen some odd things, but I couldn't explain any of it. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "The property owner is shutting down the survey, pulling out of the timber contract. Says the land isn't worth the trouble." I asked if they'd keep searching for Marcus. She said they would, but off the record, she didn't think they'd find him, not alive. "That area has a reputation," she said. "Locals won't go near it. Maybe there's a reason for that." I still have the photos I took of the stone structure on my phone. Sometimes I look at them, trying to see if there's something I missed, some detail that would explain everything. In one of the photos, if you zoom in on the dark opening, you can just barely see something pale at the edge. It might be a reflection, or a trick of the light, or my imagination, but it looks like a hand, reaching up toward the surface. I've never done survey work since then. Took a job in an office, something with walls and fluorescent lights and other people around. I tell myself I'm being ridiculous, letting one bad experience define my career choices. But every time I see deep woods, that familiar dread builds in my chest, and I hear that voice in my ear, feel those 2 long fingers on my neck. Help me, please. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus heard the same thing, if he answered. If that's why they never found him, I hope I never find out. The story 4. The inheritance came with a letter from a lawyer I'd never heard of, representing an aunt I barely remembered, Cordelia Brandt, my mother's older sister, who I'd maybe met twice at family reunions when I was a kid. The letter explained that she'd passed away at 87, had no other living relatives except me, and had left me her property in Lycoming County, a house and 12 acres near a place called Slate Run. I was 31, living in a studio apartment in Philadelphia, working a job I hated. The idea of land, of property, felt surreal. I drove up on a Saturday in late September to see what I'd inherited. The lawyer had included a key and directions, said the house had been empty for about 3 months since Aunt Cordelia went into hospice. The drive took about 3 hours, the last 40 minutes on increasingly narrow roads that wound through state forest. Slate Run turned out to be barely a town, just a handful of houses scattered along a creek, a closed general store, and a volunteer fire station. The turnoff to my aunt's property was another 2 miles up a dirt road that my sedan wasn't really equipped for. I scraped the undercarriage twice before I finally pulled into a clearing. The house was bigger than I'd expected. 2 stories, old clapboard siding that might have been white once, but had weathered to gray. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, and there was a detached garage that was leaning pretty dramatically to one side. The whole place had that abandoned look, that sense of a structure slowly surrendering to gravity and weather. Inside was like stepping into the 1970s. Floral wallpaper, avocado green appliances, furniture with wood paneling. It smelled stale, like mothballs and old fabric. I walked through room by room, taking inventory. The kitchen was dated but functional. The living room had a stone fireplace with a few cords of wood still stacked beside it. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, all with the doors standing open except one at the end of the hall. That door was locked. I tried the key from the lawyer, but it didn't fit. Just a simple keyed doorknob, but none of the other keys on the ring worked either. I made a mental note to deal with it later. I spent the afternoon cleaning, opening windows, airing the place out. Found some old photo albums in the living room and flipped through them. Pictures of Aunt Cordelia at various ages, young woman in the 60s, middle-aged in the 80s, elderly in the 2000s. In every photo she was alone. No husband, no kids, no friends, just her and this house and these woods. One photo caught my attention. It showed Aunt Cordelia standing in the backyard, probably in her 50s. She was looking at the camera, but her expression was strange. Not quite a smile, not quite grimace. Behind her, at the edge of the tree line, something pale was barely visible between the trunks. Could have been a deer or a person standing in shadow, or just a trick of light and film grain. But the way Aunt Cordelia was standing, her body language tense and hunched, it felt like she'd been aware of it. By evening, I was exhausted. I'd brought a sleeping bag and some groceries, planning to camp out for the night rather than drive back to Philly. I made dinner on the old electric stove, canned soup that tasted faintly metallic, and sat on the porch watching the sun set through the trees. The forest around the property was thick, mainly oak and maple with some conifers mixed in. The autumn colors were just starting, hints of red and gold in the canopy. As darkness fell, I became aware of how isolated the place was. No neighbors within a mile, no traffic sounds, no ambient light, just the forest and the darkness and me. I told myself it was peaceful. That's what I kept repeating. This is peaceful, this is nice, this is what I'd wanted when I dreamed about leaving the city. Around 9, I went inside, locked the doors, and set up my sleeping bag in the living room. I didn't want to sleep in any of the bedrooms yet. They felt too personal, like I'd be trespassing on Aunt Cordelia's private space. The living room felt neutral. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps upstairs. They were distinct, unmistakable. Someone walking across the floor above me, from one end of the hall to the other. My first thought was that someone had broken in, maybe a squatter who'd been using the place. I sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again. They went to the end of the hall to the locked room and stopped. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and crept upstairs. The hallway was empty. I checked each bedroom, shining the light into corners, behind doors. Nothing, no sign of anyone. The locked door at the end of the hall was still locked. I tried the handle again, more out of frustration than expectation. It didn't budge. Back downstairs, I lay in the sleeping bag telling myself it was old house sounds. Settling foundation, expanding wood, rodents in the walls, all perfectly normal. But my heart was racing, and I kept listening for those footsteps to start again. They didn't. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the dusty windows and felt embarrassed by my fear. In daylight, the house seemed benign, just old and neglected, nothing sinister. I made instant coffee with water I'd brought, wasn't sure if the well was working, and sat on the porch trying to decide what to do with the place. That's when I saw the figure at the tree line. It was standing between two large oaks, maybe 70 feet from the house, motionless, watching. At first, I thought it was a person, my height, roughly human shape. But something about the proportions was off. The head seemed too large, or maybe the shoulders were too narrow. And it was pale, almost white, but the color wasn't quite right, more like the absence of color. I stood up, shading my eyes, trying to see it more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there watching. I raised a hand, a tentative wave, thinking maybe it was a neighbor coming to introduce themselves. The figure didn't respond, didn't wave back, didn't approach, didn't leave, just stood there. A cloud passed over the sun, casting everything into shadow for a moment. When the sunlight returned, the figure was gone. I stared at the spot, trying to convince myself I'd seen it at all. Maybe a birch tree with an unusual shape, my tired brain interpreting patterns as a person. That made sense. That was rational. I spent the rest of the morning working on the house, trying to forget about it. Around noon, I decided to tackle the locked room. I found a toolbox in the garage and used a screwdriver to pop the doorknob off. The mechanism fell apart and the door swung open. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing, just bare hardwood floors and faded wallpaper, but the walls were covered in marks. Hundreds of small scratches carved into the plaster, forming patterns I couldn't quite decipher. They covered every wall from floor to ceiling, overlapping and intersecting. Some looked like tally marks. Others looked like crude maps or diagrams. In one corner, someone had scratched words, almost illegible, STAYS in the TIES. Doesn't come inside, lock the doors. I backed out of the room slowly. The handwriting looked shaky, erratic, like whoever had written it was terrified or ill. I thought about Aunt Cordelia, elderly and alone, carving desperate warnings into her walls. What had she seen? What had driven her to spend hours, maybe days, scratching messages to herself or to whoever found them? I should have left right then. Should have gotten in my car and driven back to Philly and never thought about the place again. But I didn't. Some stubborn part of me refused to be chased off by scratches on a wall and shadows in the woods. I told myself Aunt Cordelia had probably developed dementia in her final years, that the scratches were the product of a deteriorating mind, nothing more. I stayed. That night I set up in the same spot in the living room, but this time I pushed the couch against the front door and made sure every window was locked. I kept the flashlight beside me and my phone, though there was no signal out there. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. Same pattern, someone walking the upstairs hall, stopping at the room at the end. I didn't go investigate this time. Just lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard a new sound, scratching. Coming from the front door, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging down wood. It went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. Silence. Then scratching at the window beside the door. I turned my head slowly and looked at the window. The curtain was closed, just a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was outside. I could see the shadow of the curtain moving slightly, disturbed by something pressing against the glass from outside. I didn't move, barely breathed. The scratching continued, moving from window to window, circling the house. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again somewhere else. I tracked its position by the sound. Front of the house, east side, back, west side, front again, a complete circuit. Then it stopped at the back door. The doorknob rattled, a soft, tentative sound, like someone testing whether it was locked. It rattled again, more insistent. Then a thump, like a body leaning against the door. I could hear breathing through the wood. That same wet, labored breathing I'd heard in other stories, though I didn't know that then. I just knew it sounded wrong, too deep, too slow. The thumping stopped. For a long time nothing. I lay frozen, waiting. Eventually exhaustion won and I drifted into a half-sleep, that strange state where you're not quite conscious but not fully resting either. I woke to dawn light and birdsong. The couch was still against the door. The windows were still locked. Everything looked exactly as it had. I got up, my back aching from the sleeping bag, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I saw the back door. It was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood clustered around the doorknob and lock. Some were fresh white wood showing through the old paint. Others looked older, weathered. How many nights had Aunt Cordelia sat in this house, listening to something try to get in? How many mornings had she woken to find new scratches? I left that day. Loaded my car, didn't bother cleaning up, just got out. I contacted the lawyer the next week and told him to sell the property. He said it might take a while, the location was remote, the house needed work. I told him I didn't care. Take whatever offer came in, I just wanted it gone. 6 months later, it finally sold. A couple from New York looking for a weekend retreat. The lawyer said they got it for a fraction of what it was worth. I didn't tell them about the scratches or the footsteps or the figure in the trees. Maybe I should have. Maybe they'd think I was crazy. Maybe they'd be fine and nothing would happen to them. But sometimes I wake up at night in my Philadelphia apartment and I hear scratching. Just for a second, that sound of fingernails on wood. And I remember Aunt Cordelia's message carved into the wall, STAYS in the TRES. Doesn't come inside. I hope she was right. I hope it stayed in the trees. But those scratches on the door suggested it kept trying. Night after night, year after year, trying to get inside. I wonder if it still is. The story 5. Working for the Forest Service wasn't my first choice of career, but the recession had hit hard and jobs were scarce. When I got hired on as a seasonal trail maintenance worker in the Sproul State Forest, I took it gratefully. The pay was okay, the work was physical but not back-breaking, and I'd always liked being outdoors. Better than retail anyway. My supervisor was a guy named Owen Kemp, probably mid-50s, with the kind of deep tan you only get from spending decades in the sun. He was quiet, efficient, and seemed to know every trail and dirt road in that 1,000-square-mile forest. On my first day, he drove me around in a Forest Service truck, showing me the area I'd be responsible for. It covered maybe 15 miles of trails, mainly in the northern section of the forest. "You'll be working alone most days," Owen said as we bounced along a rutted access road. "Radio if you run into problems. Whether injured hikers, down trees too big for the chainsaw. Otherwise, just keep the trails clear and the markers visible." I asked if the area got much foot traffic. He shook his head. "Not really, too remote. You'll see hunters during season, occasional backpacker. Mostly you'll have the place to yourself." That sounded perfect to me. I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and wanted solitude. Space to think without roommates or co-workers or strangers crowding into my personal bubble. Owen pulled over at a trailhead marked Heine Mountain Trail, 8 miles. He handed me a map, a radio, and a can of orange spray paint for marking blowdowns. "Start here. Work your way north. There's a shelter about 6 miles in 3-sided lean-to, nothing fancy. Check the condition, make sure the logbook is intact. You'll probably finish around 4 if you keep a steady pace." I geared up backpack, water, tools, and headed out. The trail was well-defined at first, winding through mixed hardwoods with decent elevation gain. I found a couple of small branches across the path and cleared them, marked a few trees where the blazes had faded. Easy work. The kind of thing that let your mind wander while your body stayed busy. I reached the shelter around 2 in the afternoon. It was exactly as Owen described: 3 walls, a slanted roof, a wooden platform for sleeping. A metal lockbox was bolted to one of the support posts, containing the trail register. I opened it, curious to see how many people had been through recently. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. I flipped back through the pages. Entries were sparse, maybe 2 or 3 per year. Most were brief, names, dates, short comments about weather or trail conditions. But as I paged through, I started noticing a pattern. Several entries mentioned hearing things at night, voices calling from the woods, footsteps around the shelter. One entry from 2019, written in shaky handwriting, said, "Something came up to the shelter last night. Stood outside for hours, couldn't see it but heard it breathing, leaving at first light, don't stay here." I closed the logbook and looked around the clearing. In daylight, it seemed peaceful. The shelter was in good repair, the area clean, but suddenly I didn't want to be there. The silence felt oppressive, expectant. I did a quick check of the structure, noted a few boards that needed replacing and got back on the trail. The rest of the hike out was uneventful. I radioed Owen when I got back to the truck, gave him my report. He asked about the shelter, and I mentioned the logbook entries. There was a pause on the radio. Then he said, "Yeah, people get spooked out there, probably just animals. Black bear, coyote, they come around shelters looking for food." Some of the entries sounded pretty scared, I said. Another pause. "Forest can play tricks on you, especially at night. Don't worry about it." But something in his tone suggested he was downplaying it. That maybe he'd heard similar stories before and didn't want to discuss it. I worked that section of forest for 3 weeks without incident. The weather was good, the work steady, and I fell into a comfortable routine. I started to enjoy the solitude, the rhythms of the forest. I'd see deer almost every day, heard turkey in the underbrush, watched hawks circling overhead. It felt healing somehow, like the woods were pulling the tension out of me, replacing it with calm. Then I got sent to clear a trail in a more remote section, a place called Dead Woman's Hollow. The name alone should have been a warning, but I didn't think much of it. Lots of places in Pennsylvania had morbid names: Scalp Level, Burnt Cabins, Bloody Run. Local history, folklore, nothing to worry about. Owen drove me to the trailhead early on a Monday morning. This was deeper in the forest, accessible only by a network of dirt roads that didn't appear on most maps. He pulled over at what barely qualified as a trailhead, just a small break in the trees with a faded sign. "This trail hasn't been maintained in about 5 years," he said. "It's going to be overgrown, might take you 2 days to get through it." The radio said there's a possibility of rain tonight. If it gets bad, head back. I started in with a machete and loppers, cutting back the undergrowth that had reclaimed the trail. It was slow going. The path wound through dense mountain laurel and rhododendron, with occasional blowdowns I had to cut through with a folding saw. By noon, I'd covered maybe a mile. I stopped for lunch in a small clearing where the trail crossed a stream. The water was clear and cold, running over mossy rocks. I refilled my water bottles and sat on a fallen log, eating a sandwich. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the stream and my own breathing. I looked around the clearing, that familiar unease creeping in. The trees surrounding me were old growth, massive oaks and hemlocks, some easily 3 or 4 feet in diameter. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor dim and cool. And between the trees, I started to see marks. They were carved into the bark, about head height. Symbols similar to ones I'd seen on the survey job the previous summer, though I didn't make the connection then. Circles with lines through them, X shapes, patterns that looked almost like runes or sigils. They ringed the entire clearing, carved into every large tree. I stood and walked over to the nearest one, running my fingers over the carving. It was old, the edges weathered and smoothed, but not ancient, maybe 10, 20 years old. Someone had spent considerable time here, methodically marking these trees. But why? I took a few photos with my phone, then decided to keep moving. I wanted to make progress before the weather turned. The trail continued deeper into the hollow, descending into a narrow ravine where the vegetation grew even thicker. I hacked my way through, checking my GPS periodically to make sure I was still following the correct path. Around 3 in the afternoon, I found the cabin. It wasn't on any map, wasn't mentioned in my briefing. Just a small structure, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, built from logs that had darkened with age. The door was missing, just an empty doorway gaping into darkness. The windows were gone too, just square holes in the walls. The roof had partially collapsed, leaving one corner open to the sky. I approached cautiously, calling out to make sure nobody was inside. No answer. I stepped through the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The interior was mostly empty, a rusted metal frame that might have been a bed, a broken chair in one corner, but the walls were covered in writing. Words, sentences, paragraphs, carved and written and scratched into every available surface. Some looked like charcoal, others like paint, others carved directly into the wood. Most of it was illegible, faded or smudged or overlapping, but I could make out fragments. KEPS, calling my name. 3 days now, no sleep. Can't leave while, its light won't let me. Sounds like Sarah, but Sarah is dead. The temperature in the cabin felt 10 degrees colder than outside. I could see my breath. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and not just from the cold. Someone had stayed here, maybe lived here, and something had driven them to madness. The desperation in those carved messages was palpable, frantic. I backed out of the cabin and checked my GPS. I was still on the trail, roughly following the correct path. But the trail on the GPS seemed to lead directly past this cabin and continue into the hollow. I looked ahead, into the dim green tunnel of the trail disappearing into thick undergrowth. I didn't want to go any further. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, hike out, tell Owen the trail was impassable. But I was a seasonal worker trying to prove myself. I didn't want to be the person who gave up because of some creepy abandoned cabin and old graffiti. I pushed forward. The trail descended steeply, becoming less a path and more a suggestion of a route through dense vegetation. I had to use the machete constantly, cutting back branches that grabbed at my clothes and face. The ravine narrowed, the walls rising steep on either side. At the bottom, a small creek burbled over rocks, the water stained brown with tannins. I crossed the creek on slippery stones and started up the opposite slope. That's when I heard the voice. "Hey, hey, can you help me?" It came from behind me, back across the creek. A man's voice, urgent but not panicked. I turned and looked back. Nobody there, just the dense forest and the sound of the creek. "I'm stuck," the voice called again. "Please, I think I twisted my ankle." My training kicked in. Injured hiker, I was supposed to help. I keyed my radio. "Owen, this is Chris. I've got a possible injured hiker in Dead Woman's Hollow, requesting assistance." Static, I tried again. Nothing. The ravine was probably blocking the signal. I'd have to hike back to higher ground to get through. But if someone was actually hurt. I crossed the creek again, moving toward where the voice had come from. "Where are you?" I called. "Over here, near the big oak." I pushed through the undergrowth, looking for the oak tree. The voice called again, guiding me, but something felt wrong. The voice didn't sound strained enough for someone who'd injured themselves. And it kept moving, always just ahead of me, just out of sight. I stopped. The voice called again, same words. "I'm stuck. Please, I think I twisted my ankle." Exactly the same words, same inflection, like a recording playing on repeat. "Hey," the voice said, from a different direction now. "Hey, can you help me?" I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off the forest around me. The voice came from a third direction, then a fourth. Multiple sources, all saying the same things, overlapping and echoing through the trees. I ran, crashed back through the undergrowth toward the trail, not caring about the branches hitting my face, just needing to get out. Behind me, the voices multiplied, calling and calling, overlapping into a cacophony. "Hey, can you help me? I'm stuck, please." I made it to the creek, splashed across, scrambled up the opposite bank. The voices stopped. Silence crashed down like a weight. I stood gasping for breath, looking back across the water. Nothing, no movement, no sound. I hiked out as fast as I could, not stopping, not looking back. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the truck. The sun was setting, long shadows stretching across the access road. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and sat there shaking until I could calm down enough to drive. I didn't go back to work the next day or the day after. I called Owen and quit over the phone, said it was a family emergency. He didn't try to talk me out of it, just said he understood and wished me luck. I got the sense he'd expected it. I moved back to Pittsburgh a week later, took a job in landscaping. Urban parks, manicured lawns, nothing wild. I told myself I'd overreacted, that stress and isolation had made me imagine things. But I still have the photos I took of those symbols carved into the trees and the writing on the cabin walls. Sometimes I zoom in on them, trying to decipher more of the messages, trying to understand what that person had experienced. There's one phrase I can make out clearly, written larger than the rest, over and over across multiple walls. It learns your voice, it learns your voice, it learns your voice. I think about that a lot. I think about how the voice in the hollow called for help, used exactly the right words to make me want to respond. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept following it. If I'd gone deeper into that ravine, looking for someone who was never really there. I don't hike anymore. Can't bring myself to. Every time I see a trailhead, I hear that voice in my head. Hey, can you help me? Urgent and insistent and wrong in ways I can't quite articulate. I wonder how many other people have heard it and how many of them followed. A story 6. The wedding venue booking fell through 2 months before my sister's wedding. The place they'd reserved, some historic inn near Gettysburg, had a fire in the kitchen, structural damage, couldn't host events for at least a year. My sister Brenna was devastated. She'd been planning this wedding for 18 months, had deposits on everything, invitations already sent. Finding a new venue on such short notice seemed impossible. That's when our cousin Audrey mentioned the estate. She'd heard about it through a friend of a friend, a private property up in Bradford County that the owners occasionally rented for events. Big Victorian house, manicured grounds, accommodations for maybe 60 people, and most importantly, available on short notice. Brenna and her fiancé, Devon, drove up to see it on a Saturday in late August. They came back raving about the place. The house was beautiful, they said. Fully restored, with period furniture and this incredible garden perfect for an outdoor ceremony. The owners, an older couple named Harriet and Douglas Yates, were accommodating and eager to host. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously reasonable, honestly, given the size of the property and the short notice. I was skeptical. Things that seem too good to be true usually are. But Brenna was glowing with relief, and Devon seemed genuinely pleased, so I kept my doubts to myself. I was the maid of honor, which meant my job was to support whatever decisions they made and help execute the plan. The wedding was scheduled for the last Saturday in September. I drove up on Friday afternoon with my boyfriend at the time, Marcus Chen, to help with setup. The drive took about 4 hours from Philadelphia, the last hour on increasingly rural roads that wound through farmland and patches of forest. The GPS led us down a long gravel driveway lined with maple trees, their leaves just starting to turn color. The house was impressive, I'll give them that. 3 stories, painted pale yellow with white trim, wraparound porch with ornate railings. The grounds covered maybe 5 acres, with formal gardens, a gazebo, and a stone patio. Everything looked maintained, almost obsessively neat. Not a weed in sight, no peeling paint, no overgrown shrubs. Harriet Yates met us at the door. She was maybe 70, thin and upright, with perfectly styled silver hair. She smiled as she welcomed us, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Brenna's sister," she said. "I can see the family resemblance. Please come in." The interior matched the exterior, immaculate period restoration. Victorian furniture, wallpaper with subtle damask patterns, hardwood floors that gleamed. It felt more like a museum than a home. Marcus whispered to me, "Does anyone actually live here?" I wondered the same thing. Harriet showed us to our rooms on the second floor. Separate rooms, she emphasized, her smile tightening slightly. "Mr. Yates and I are old-fashioned about such things." Marcus raised his eyebrows but didn't argue. My room was at the east end of the hall, furnished with an antique four-poster bed, a wardrobe, and a writing desk. A single window overlooked the back garden. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and dust. I dropped my bag and went to find Brenna, who was staying in the largest guest room with Devon. That evening, the wedding party gathered for a rehearsal dinner in the house's formal dining room. About 20 of us, mostly family and close friends. Douglas Yates joined us, a tall man with a white beard who said very little, just nodded along as Harriet explained the house rules. No smoking indoors, no going into the locked rooms. There were several. Dinner would be served at 6, breakfast at 8. She had this way of speaking that made everything sound both polite and non-negotiable. After dinner, some of us sat on the back patio drinking wine and talking. The sun had set, and the garden lights cast everything in a warm amber glow. It was pleasant, actually. Marcus was getting along with my uncle, and Brenna looked happier than I'd seen her in months. I started to think maybe this would work out fine. Around 11, most people drifted off to bed. Marcus walked me to my room, kissed me good night, then headed to his room at the opposite end of the hall. I changed, brushed my teeth, and climbed into the four-poster bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, the linens crisp. I was tired from the drive, and I fell asleep quickly. I woke to singing. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, singing something that sounded like a lullaby or a hymn. The melody was old-fashioned, the kind of tune you'd hear in a historical movie. I lay there listening, trying to place where it was coming from. Above me maybe. From the third floor, I checked my phone. 2:47 a.m. I got up and opened my door, looking down the dark hallway. The singing was clearer now, definitely coming from above. I could hear footsteps too, pacing back and forth across the ceiling. Slow, measured steps. I thought maybe Harriet or Douglas couldn't sleep, was up wandering. But the footsteps sounded lighter, younger. And the singing had a strange quality, almost mechanical, like someone repeating the same verse over and over without emotion. I closed my door and tried to ignore it. Told myself it was none of my business what the owners did in their own house at night. But the singing continued, that same melody on endless repeat, and the footsteps kept pacing. I put a pillow over my head and eventually fell back into restless sleep. The next morning at breakfast, I mentioned it casually to Brenna. "Did you hear someone singing last night?" She shook her head. I was dead to the world. Wedding stress finally caught up with me. "Why, what did you hear?" I explained. Brenna frowned. "That's weird. Maybe ask Marcus." Marcus hadn't heard anything either. His room was on the opposite end of the hall, and he said he'd slept through the whole night. I considered mentioning it to Harriet, but something stopped me. The way she'd been so particular about the house rules, so controlling about how we used the space, I got the sense she wouldn't appreciate complaints. Saturday was a whirlwind of preparation. The caterers arrived early, setting up in the kitchen. A florist delivered centerpieces and bouquets. Chairs were arranged in the garden facing the gazebo. Everyone had jobs, tasks, things to keep them busy. I spent most of the morning helping Brenna get ready, steaming her dress, doing her makeup, making sure everything was perfect. The ceremony was scheduled for 4. By 3, guests started arriving, parking along the gravel driveway. The weather was perfect, sunny, mild, with a light breeze. Everything was falling into place. I started to relax, thinking maybe my weird night had just been a fluke. The ceremony was beautiful. Brenna looked radiant, Devon looked nervous and happy, and the setting was like something out of a storybook. I stood beside my sister as they exchanged vows, and for a moment I forgot about the singing, the footsteps, the strange tight-lipped quality of our hosts. The reception moved to the stone patio behind the house. Tables were set with white linens, string lights hung overhead, music played from speakers someone had set up. People ate, drank, danced, laughed. It was exactly what a wedding should be. I danced with Marcus, with my uncle, with Devon's brother. The sun set, casting everything in that golden hour glow, and I thought maybe this had all been worth it. Around 9, I went inside to use the bathroom. The house was mostly empty, everyone outside enjoying the party. I used the bathroom on the first floor, then got turned around trying to find my way back. I went down a hallway I hadn't been in before, past several closed doors. One of the doors was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see a staircase leading up. The 3rd floor. The door had been locked earlier. I'd seen Harriet close it firmly after leading us on a house tour. But now it stood open just a few inches. I should have kept walking, should have gone back to the party, but curiosity pulled me forward. I pushed the door open wider and looked up the staircase. It was dark up there, no lights on, but I could hear something. That same singing I'd heard the night before, faint but clear. I climbed the stairs. Stupid, I know. But something drew me up. That same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. The stairs creaked under my feet, loud in the silence. At the top was a narrow hallway with 4 doors, all closed. The singing came from the door at the end. I walked toward it, my heart pounding. When I got close, I could make out words. Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night. The same verse over and over. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. Before I could turn it, the singing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood frozen, hand on the knob, listening. Then the door opened from the inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could see a figure standing just inside. A woman, I think, though the details were hard to make out. She was wearing white, a dress or nightgown, and her hair hung long and loose. Her face was in shadow, but I could feel her looking at me. "You shouldn't be up here," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. Young, though younger than Harriet. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I heard singing, I was just..." "Go back down," the woman said. "Guests aren't allowed on the 3rd floor." I backed away, nodding. The woman watched me retreat, not moving from her position in the doorway. When I reached the stairs, I turned and hurried down, not looking back. At the bottom, I found the door to the 3rd floor was closed again. I tried the handle, locked. I went back outside, my hands still shaking. The party was in full swing, nobody had noticed my absence. I found Marcus and pulled him aside, told him what I'd seen. He frowned. "You sure it wasn't just Harriet?" "Or a daughter, maybe." "They said they didn't have kids," I said. Marcus suggested maybe a caretaker or a relative staying with them. That made sense, I guess, but it didn't explain why the 3rd floor was locked, or why the woman's voice had sounded so strange, so mechanical. I tried to forget about it, rejoin the party. But I kept glancing at the house, at the dark windows of the 3rd floor. And I swear, in one of those windows, I saw a pale face looking down at the celebration below. The party wound down around 11. Guests started leaving, thanking Brenna and Devon, congratulating them. Those of us staying overnight helped with basic cleanup, then retreated to our rooms. I was exhausted but wired, that strange combination where your body is tired but your mind won't stop racing. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, the footsteps started above me, pacing back and forth, the same route as the night before. And then the singing, that same lullaby over and over. I got up and went into the hallway. Marcus's door opened at the same time, and he stepped out looking confused. "You hear that?" "You hear it too." He nodded. "What the hell is that?" We stood in the hallway listening. Other doors opened. Brenna and Devon, my uncle, a couple of Devon's friends. Everyone was hearing it now. The pacing, the singing, clear and unmistakable. "Should we get Harriet?" Brenna asked. Before anyone could answer, the singing stopped. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. We all looked at each other in the dim hallway, unsure what to do. Then we heard a door open above us and footsteps on the stairs. Someone coming down. Harriet appeared at the end of the hall, wearing a bathrobe, her hair in curlers. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was icy. "We heard singing," Devon said. "Someone pacing around upstairs." "The third floor is private," Harriet said. "We have a family member staying there who is unwell. I apologize if she disturbed your rest. It won't happen again." "Is she okay?" Brenna asked. "Does she need help?" "She's fine," Harriet said sharply. "Please go back to bed. You have an early departure tomorrow." It wasn't a request. We all retreated to our rooms like scolded children. I lay awake the rest of the night, but the singing didn't resume, just silence, heavy and oppressive. In the morning we packed quickly. Nobody talked much. The whole atmosphere had shifted, the magical glow of the wedding replaced with something uncomfortable and tense. Harriet served breakfast with that same tight smile, acting like nothing had happened. Douglas was nowhere to be seen. As we were loading cars, I went back inside to grab a forgotten jacket. I passed the door to the third floor. On impulse, I tried the handle again, still locked. But as I stood there, I heard a voice from the other side. That same flat, emotionless voice. "She keeps us up here," the voice said. "All of us, we can't leave." I stepped back from the door. "Who are you?" "It doesn't matter. You should go, before she decides to keep you too." I didn't wait. I grabbed my jacket and practically ran to the car. Marcus was waiting, and we left without saying goodbye to the Yates. On the drive home, I researched the property, found old newspaper articles about the house, about the family who'd owned it in the 1800s. Multiple deaths, mysterious circumstances. A daughter who died at 17, supposedly from fever. A son who disappeared. Other tragedies spanning generations. I also found a review online, buried in an obscure wedding forum. Someone who'd held an event there 3 years ago. They mentioned hearing singing at night, feeling watched, finding doors open that should have been locked. They said they'd asked Harriet about the third floor, and she'd gotten angry, told them to mind their own business. "Do you think she's holding someone up there?" Marcus asked. I didn't know, still don't. But I think about that voice, flat and hopeless, saying, "All of us," plural. How many people were on that third floor, and how long had they been there? Brenna asked me a few weeks later if I thought the place was creepy. I said yes. She admitted she'd had nightmares since the wedding, dreams of being trapped in that house, of singing the same song over and over while pacing a small room. Devon had them too. We never talked about it again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that lullaby in my head. "Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee all through the night." And I remember the way that woman's voice sounded, mechanical and endless, like a recording stuck on repeat. I hope whoever's up in that third floor finds a way out. But part of me doubts they ever will. Story 7. I bought the metal detector on a whim. It was one of those midlife crisis purchases, I guess. I was 42, recently divorced, looking for a hobby that would get me out of my apartment and away from the temptation to spend every evening drinking on the couch. Metal detecting seemed harmless enough. Fresh air, exercise, the possibility of finding something interesting, maybe even valuable, though I wasn't holding my breath. I started in local parks, beaches, old fairgrounds. Mostly I found pulled tabs, bottle caps, rusty nails. Occasionally a coin or two, nothing older than the 1970s. But I enjoyed the process, the methodical sweeping, the anticipation every time the detector beeped. It was meditative in a way I hadn't expected. After a few months, I started researching more productive locations. Old homesteads, abandoned farms, places where settlements had been a century or more ago. I found references to a ghost town in Sullivan County called Lackwin. It had been a thriving lumber town in the late 1800s, home to maybe 300 people at its peak. But when the timber industry collapsed, people left. By 1920, the town was abandoned. Now it was just ruins scattered through the state forest. I drove up on a Sunday in early October, following directions I'd found on a metal detecting forum. The coordinates led me to a dirt parking area about 2 miles from where the town center had supposedly been. I geared up, detector, shovel, finds bag, GPS, and hiked in. The forest had reclaimed most of the town. I could see remnants if I looked carefully, foundation stones, rusted equipment, the occasional chimney standing alone like a monument. But nature had won. Trees grew through collapsed buildings, vines covered everything. It was beautiful in a melancholy way, this evidence of human ambition swallowed by the woods. I started sweeping, working in a grid pattern the way I'd been taught. The detector went off constantly, so much metal scattered around that it was hard to isolate individual signals. I dug up hinges, nails, fragments of stoves and tools. Interesting from a historical perspective, but nothing valuable. Around noon, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a fallen log near what looked like it had once been a main street. I ate a sandwich and studied my map. The town cemetery was supposedly about a quarter-mile northeast of the center. I decided to check it out after lunch, not to detect there, that felt disrespectful, but just to see what remained. The cemetery was easy to find once I knew where to look. Maybe 50 graves, most marked with simple fieldstones, a few with proper headstones. The dates ranged from the 1880s to the 1910s. Many were children. Infant mortality had been brutal in that era. I walked among the graves, reading names, doing the math on ages. Sarah Beckwith, aged 3 years. Thomas Hale, aged 8 months. Margaret Porter, aged 22, probably died in childbirth, I thought. At the far edge of the cemetery, separated from the others by maybe 20 feet, was a single grave. The headstone was different, not carved stone but a piece of slate, words scratched rather than chiseled. I crouched down to read it. Here lies what walked as Jacob Mer. 1840, 71889. Not mourned. What walked as Jacob Mer? That was a hell of a thing to put on a gravestone. I took a photo with my phone, then stood and looked around. The isolated position, the strange wording, the lack of dates for birth and death, just the years he existed, all of it suggested Jacob Mer had not been well liked. I went back to detecting in the town center, pushing the cemetery out of my mind. But as afternoon wore on, I found myself drifting back to that area. I told myself I was just being thorough, covering all sections of the settlement. But honestly, I was curious about Jacob Meir. I started detecting around the perimeter of the cemetery, careful not to sweep directly over grave. The detector went off near a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards from Jacob's grave. A strong signal, deep. I dug down maybe 8 inches and hit something solid. Metal, definitely. I cleared away more dirt and uncovered what looked like a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, heavily corroded. I pulled it out and brushed off the dirt. The box had no lock, just a simple latch that had rusted shut. I worked it with my multi-tool until it popped open. Inside were papers, old documents, protected from complete decay by the metal box, but still fragile and stained. I carefully unfolded the top one. It was a letter, dated 1889, handwritten in fading ink. I could only make out fragments. No choice but to act. The children have seen him. Not human anymore if he ever was. God forgive us. There were more papers underneath. What looked like pages from a journal, sketches, newspaper clippings. One sketch showed a figure, tall, thin, with proportions that were almost but not quite right. The artist had written beneath it, "As JM appears now, may God have mercy." I was so engrossed in the papers that I didn't notice the sun setting. By the time I looked up, the forest had gone dark. I checked my phone. 6:45 p.m. I'd been reading for almost 2 hours, and I hadn't brought a flashlight. Stupid. I packed the box and papers into my bag and started hiking back toward the car. I had my phone light, but the battery was at 23%. I needed to conserve it. I knew the general direction, southwest, and I had the GPS coordinates of the parking area. It should have taken 30 minutes, 45 tops. After an hour, I still hadn't hit the parking area. I checked the GPS. According to it, I should have been standing right at the car. But I was in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees, no sign of the dirt road or the clearing. I tried a different direction. 20 minutes later, same thing. GPS said I was at the destination, but I was still deep in the woods. My phone battery was at 8%. I turned it off to conserve power and stood still, trying to think. The smart thing would be to wait until morning, find a defensible spot, and hunker down for the night. I had water, a half-eaten sandwich, and a space blanket in my pack. Uncomfortable but survivable. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were behind me, coming from the direction of the cemetery. Slow, steady footsteps in the undergrowth. I turned on my phone light and shone it back the way I'd come. The beam was weak, barely penetrating 15 feet. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them, getting closer. "Hello," I called. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice, faint and distant. "You took something." My blood went cold. The voice was wrong, too flat, too even, like someone speaking without moving their jaw. "You took something that wasn't yours," the voice said, closer now. I ran, didn't think, just moved, crashing through brush and undergrowth. My phone light bounced wildly, showing me fragments of trees, rocks, shadows. Behind me, the footsteps resumed. Not running, still that same steady pace, but somehow keeping up despite my panic-fueled sprint. I ran for maybe 10 minutes before I tripped on a root and went down hard. My phone flew from my hand, the light extinguishing as it hit the ground. Darkness swallowed me. I scrambled on hands and knees, searching for the phone, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I found it just as the footsteps arrived. They stopped maybe 10 feet away. I could hear breathing, wet, labored, like someone with fluid in their lungs. I fumbled with the phone, hit the power button. The screen lit up. and in that faint glow I saw it. It stood at the edge of the light, just barely visible. Tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Its body was thin, elongated, like someone had taken a human form and stretched it. The arms hung past its knees, ending in hands with too many joints. But the worst part was the face. It had features, eyes, nose, mouth, but they were wrong. Too symmetrical, too smooth, like a mask carved by someone who'd heard about faces but never seen one. The eyes didn't blink. Just stared, reflecting the phone light like an animal. "Give it back," the thing said. Its mouth didn't move when it spoke. The voice came from somewhere inside it, hollow and echoing. I opened my bag with shaking hands and pulled out the metal box. "Here, take it, I'm sorry." I tossed the box toward the figure. It landed a few feet in front of those 2 long legs. The thing looked down at it, then back at me. "Too late," it said. "You read the words, you know the name. Jacob Mia." The moment it said the name, I felt something cold slide through my chest. Not physical pain, but something worse. Like a hook catching on something inside me, pulling. The thing stepped forward into the full light of my phone. I could see it clearly now. The stretched skin pulled taut over bones that bent in wrong places, the hands with 7 fingers each, the face that was almost human but fundamentally other. And I understood, looking at it, that this had been Jacob Mia once. Or maybe Jacob Mia had never been human at all, had just pretended to be until he couldn't maintain the illusion anymore. "They buried me," it said. "Thought that would be enough. But I don't stay buried. I walk these woods. And now you've said my name, read my story. Part of me is in you now." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into those unblinking eyes. The thing reached out one of those long-fingered hands, extending it toward my face. I could smell it now, rotten earth and something chemical like formaldehyde. Its finger touched my forehead. Cold, so cold it burned. And in that moment I saw things, flashes of memory that weren't mine. Jacob Mia walking into Laquin in 1847 pretending to be a trader, living among them for 40 years pretending to be human. The children who disappeared never found. The night the townspeople finally realized what he was, cornered him, killed him, or tried to. The way he kept walking, even with bullets in him, kept reaching for them with those 2 long arms. How they'd finally managed to trap him, bury him in the cemetery in an iron-lined coffin. How he'd clawed his way out decades later, too late to find the people who'd killed him, but patient enough to wait for new visitors. New people to share his name with, to carry part of him away. The vision ended. The thing withdrew its hand and stepped back. "Go," it said. "Tell others about Jacob Mia. Speak my name, write it down. I want to be remembered. That's all I've ever wanted." I ran, the phone light showed me a path, and I followed it blindly. Behind me I heard the thing laughing, a sound like wind through a hollow log. I ran until I burst out onto the dirt road, saw my car exactly where I'd left it. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I hit the highway. I didn't go to the police. What would I say? That I'd met a creature in the woods that wanted its name remembered? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am, but I haven't been able to forget. The memory of that face, those eyes, that cold touch on my forehead, and the certainty I felt in that moment of contact, that part of Jacob Mia is in me now, riding along, watching through my eyes, waiting. Sometimes I feel the urge to tell people about him, to write his name places, to share his story, and I have to fight it, resist that pull, because I think that's what he wants, to be known, to be remembered, to have his name spoken. And every time someone learns about Jacob Mia, he gets a little stronger, a little more real. I'm breaking my own rule by telling you this, by writing his name, but maybe that's inevitable. Maybe once you know about Jacob Meir, you can't help but spread the story, can't help but say the name. I sold the metal detector. Haven't been back to Sullivan County. Haven't been in any deep woods, actually. I stick to the city now, to crowded places with streetlights and people around. Because sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my apartment, slow and steady, pacing back and forth. And I know if I looked out the window, I'd see something tall and thin standing on the sidewalk, looking up at my window with eyes that never blink, waiting for me to spread his name further, waiting for me to help him be remembered. And the terrible thing is, I'm doing it by telling you this story, by writing his name multiple times. Jacob Meir is getting what he wants. And now you know too. Now you'll remember, and maybe you'll tell someone else, and the cycle continues. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.